today we're actually going to be talking about a new report from Sutherland Institute that highlights some survey data of Utah men and U.S. men across the nation. And I kind of want to see if we can tie it all together and sort of finish off the year, if you will, with some takeaways for our audience that can inform how we address these issues starting in 2026.
Yeah, and it's so important too. We've talked to a lot of different experts throughout this series to try to understand what are the trends that men and boys are experiencing. A lot of it's national, but also I think in Utah we tend to feel like we're unique in a lot of ways, and I think that's especially relevant to this issue. So it's super important and interesting to hear about the findings of this and see how this issue is really facing men and boys here locally in Utah.
Absolutely. So we're going to include the link to the report in our show notes. Brand new report, again, from Sutherland Institute. We partnered with Y2 Analytics to survey, again, a Utah cohort and a national cohort of men. The report is called Missing Anchors, How Some Men Drift from Health, Vocation, and Purpose. And I want to start by, we included a quote in the report that is from Stoic literature, from Seneca. So for folks who are deeply into that, probably know where this quote comes from. But I thought it was really apt for this, and it's, "If a man knows not which port he sails, no wind is favorable." So kind of this idea of men who are kind of not anchored to aspects of a flourishing life, whether it's work or family or faith communities. And the survey data reveals kind of what that looks like for Utah and national men. And obviously this is on the heels of the national conversations that are happening all across the country in recent years. We've had our friend Richard Reeves on the show. And of course, his work with his book of Boys and Men and the American Institute for Boys and Men have helped to elevate this nationally.
Right.
We've also seen other policymakers around the country kind of diving into this. So it seems timely to really do a check-in with men across the country of, well, how are you doing? And this survey data, I think, will help elucidate some of that.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing this conversation elucidates is that your leisure reading is a lot more boring than mine is, Nick, because I'm not reading Stoic literature very often. But I do think this is an apt quote for describing this moment we're in. And, very clearly this has been a shift. I mean, 10 years ago, there were some conservatives talking about this issue. They had noticed the trends facing boys and men. But, as we'll talk a little bit more about, there has been just a really dramatic shift in our permission in society to talk about this issue. So we recognize that these patterns are there, but I think a lot of our hesitance to embrace and talk about solutions to these problems is that, men are fine, right? Men have had all these advantages throughout history, but that is true. And yet men are struggling in new ways, in ways that need our attention in different ways than the issues facing women and girls. And so there is this new environment, I think, thanks in large part to Richard Reeves, who's largely recognized as being, supportive of democratic policies, largely as saying, this is a real problem. And so you've got people coming to the center to talk about this issue, which is just remarkable and wonderful for this moment.
I agree. And by the way, the report does quote a rap country song.
Okay.
So I'll just tease that to the audience. So there's more popular stuff in there as well.
Okay, we need that balance, Nick. I'm glad that you have that balance within you too.
So again, I won't give it away. Go read the first part of the report. But Beth, I do want to read what kind of a segment from the beginning of the report to just set the stage. So this kind of gives the high level themes, and then start talking about how this ties into some of the conversations we've been having.
Yeah.
So here's kind of a key takeaway from the report. Again, Missing Acres, a new report from Sutherland Institute in partnership with Y2 Analytics. It says, "We found that most men in Utah and throughout the nation report general satisfaction with their health, work, family life, faith connection, and sense of meaning. Broadly speaking, work, family, faith, and community connection are often protective influences that contribute to men's internal sense of purpose and fulfillment. In other words, these civic institutions can serve as positive anchors that help men lead thriving lives. And for most men in Utah and throughout the United States, that holds true. However, a significant portion of men struggle across these domains, all too often in ways that go unnoticed and unaddressed. This silent, struggling subset of men ranges from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 of men across the nation reporting poor marks when it comes to mental health issues, vocational prospects, or their sense of purpose." So Beth, that kind of sets the stage, and kind of to your point of if folks say, well, what are men complaining about?
Yeah.
There's all this discussion about historical trends and what men have experienced. And I think what this survey data shows is that, again, most men, most of the time, are doing okay.
Yeah.
But it's this subset that's really struggling in these areas that we really want to dive into that seems relevant to what we've been talking about this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so fun to see this issue bubbling up into, social conversations that I encounter in my life. I mean, this was an idea that was, deep in the conservative think tank culture for many years, and now is at, parties. But something I've noticed in a social group that I'm part of through my church community is there was a real concern about whether or not this is something that's okay to talk about. Like, men are fine. They've had these advantages. And absolutely, I think it's helpful to point out, what this data highlights, which is that, yes, in mass, men are doing well enough. But there is a segment of the male U.S. population, men and boys, that are struggling in very serious ways. And the national data showed that. I mean, the deaths of despair, the increase in suicide rates among men, this is consistent with that. This is not to say that men en masse are declining altogether, but there is a subpopulation of men who are seriously struggling and, in need of intervention.
And one maybe editorial comment that comes to mind as well, because these and this was actually themed throughout our podcast discussions over the last year or so, that there's, as you articulated, kind of this sensitivity, like, is it okay to talk about this? And Richard Reeves addresses this. Well, what about the conversations of the work, people addressing opportunities for women and girls in modern society? And I think part of that sensitivity is a function of the fact that our modern political culture has become so sort of anchored to this idea that it's sort of groups versus groups.
Yeah.
That this sort of equity mindset of, well, we have to make sure that various groups are doing better or worse, kind of depending on their marginalization in the past. And that's where I think we just need to jettison all of that and recognize that for all Americans, there are things that folks might struggle with that we can intervene. There are things where folks might be doing well, and sort of get rid of if we talk about this group over here, does that mean we can't talk about this group? Like, I keep centering back to, this is not about pitting demographic groups against one another.
Right.
It's just about acknowledging where are people struggling and how can society help make a difference. So I think there is a little bit of a reframe.
I was talking to my 7-year-old this morning about what we were planning to do today with this conversation. And I sometimes think it can be helpful to boil things down in the way that you explain them to children. And I was saying, we were going to have this conversation about, ways that we can think about helping boys and men. And I said to him, I'm part of this group that thinks about these things. And there are other people who are parts of other groups that think about how to help girls and women. And I said, they're different because boys and girls are different. And that's true. We've had to, for a long time, I think there was a hesitance to even acknowledge that fact. But, it's true that we can devote some resources to supporting the challenges facing men and boys, and also a lot of resources to the problems facing girls and women. And those are distinct problems. I mean, that's the reality. And so absolutely, it's like we can walk and chew gum at the same time. This is not a zero-sum issue. We have the resources to support both communities. And, our society needs both communities to be thriving.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.